There is a number that grows while you sleep. Right now, tonight, the national debt of the United States is climbing by roughly $2 to $3 billion every single day. By the time you finish watching this, it will be millions of dollars larger. As of 2026, it stands at nearly $40 trillion, more than 120% of everything the American economy produces in a year. It is a figure so large it has stopped meaning anything. It is just a number that goes up. The story you have probably been told about this debt is a simple one, and it is usually a political one. One side blames reckless spending on social programs. The other blames tax cuts for the rich. Each points at the other and says, this is who broke it. And the debate has raged for decades, loud, angry, and almost entirely beside the point. Because here is what should stop you. The United States has carried a national debt for almost its entire existence. It was born in debt. When for one brief, astonishing moment, in the middle of a decade most people remember for entirely different reasons, America came within striking distance of paying it off, and its own leaders from both parties celebrated. Then, within a few short years, that progress was thrown into reverse, and the debt began the climb that has never stopped since. That decade was the 1990s, and what happened at the end of it, and what happened immediately after, tells you more about the true nature of America's debt than any argument you have ever heard. Because the deepest truth about the national debt is not that it was caused by one party or one president or one program. It is that the debt is structural. It is built into the machine. And the 1990s are the one time in modern history when we can watch in real time the machine nearly reverse itself and then watch exactly why it could not last. This is the story of how America's debt was really made, why it became effectively unpayable, and what one strange decade reveals about the whole thing. To understand it, we have to begin where the debt itself began, at the very founding of the country. The United States was, quite literally, born in debt. The revolution that created the nation was financed on credit, with money borrowed from France, from the Netherlands, and from the American people themselves in the form of bonds. When the war was won, the new country was free and it was broke. By 1790, the combined debt of the federal government and the states topped $75 million, an enormous sum for a young agricultural nation. And here the first great argument about the debt took place, an argument that has never really ended. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton looked at this mountain of debt and saw, of all things, an opportunity. He proposed that the federal government assume all of it, including the debts of the individual states, and pay it back in full. This was radical. Many asked why the whole nation should shoulder the debts of particular states. Hamilton's answer was visionary and a little dangerous. A national debt, he argued, if it is not excessive, will be a national blessing. His reasoning was subtle. If the government owed money to its own citizens and to foreign investors, then all those creditors would have a direct financial stake in the survival and success of the United States. The debt would bind the country together. It would establish American credit, proving the young nation paid what it owed so it could borrow again cheaply in the future. Debt, handled correctly, was not weakness. It was a tool of national power. On the other side stood Thomas Jefferson, who was horrified. To Jefferson, public debt was a moral danger. It concentrated power in the hands of financiers and creditors. It mortgaged the freedom of future generations to pay for the choices of the present. He believed it was fundamentally wrong for one generation to bind the next in chains of obligation it had no say in creating. Hold on to that argument. Hamilton versus Jefferson. Debt as a tool versus debt as a chain. Because it is the same argument Americans are still having today. More than 2 centuries later, it was never resolved. It was only ever postponed. Hamilton, for the record, won the first round. His system was adopted. American credit was established, and it became one of the foundations of the country's rise. But the story then does something that will surprise you, because there was exactly one moment when Jefferson's dream came true. His name was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson hated the national debt with a personal, almost furious passion. He had been ruined earlier in life by debt and financial speculation, and he carried that wound into the presidency. He called the national debt a national curse, and he set out to do something no leader of a major nation had ever done or has ever done since. He set out to pay it off entirely down to zero. And through a combination of relentless frugality, vetoing spending, and above all selling off enormous quantities of federal land in the West, he did it. In January 1835, for the first and only time in its history, the United States of America was completely free of debt. It did not last. Within 2 years, a financial panic and an economic depression, worsened in part by the very land-selling frenzy Jackson had used, plunged the government back into borrowing. The debt returned, and it never left again. But that brief moment in 1835 proved something important. It proved that paying off the debt was possible. It had been done, which raises the question that haunts the rest of this story. If it was done once, why has it never been done again? The answer is written in the events that drove the debt upward, again and again, across the next century. And when you look at what those events were, a pattern emerges immediately. The debt did not grow steadily and gently. It grew in violent, explosive jumps. And almost every one of those jumps was a war. The Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was the first great explosion. To pay for the vast armies and industrial slaughter of that conflict, the Union borrowed on a scale never before seen. The national debt exploded from around $65 million before the war to more than $2.7 billion after it, a more than 40-fold increase in a few short years. Then came the 20th century, and the wars got bigger, and so did the debt. World War I drove it up sharply again into the tens of billions. But the true turning point, the moment the debt reached a scale it would never come back down from, was World War II. The Second World War was the most expensive event in human history to that point. To defeat Germany and Japan, the United States borrowed on a scale that dwarfed everything before it. By 1946, the national debt had reached around $260 billion. As a share of the economy, it hit its all-time peak, rising to more than 120% of GDP, a level not seen again until our own time. So here's the first crucial truth about the national debt, the one the political arguments almost always miss. For most of American history, the debt was not driven by welfare or foreign aid or the everyday cost of government. It was driven by war. Wars are astronomically expensive. They must be paid for immediately, and no politician wins a war by raising taxes high enough to cover its full cost in real time. So nations borrow. They fight now and pay later. The debt is the financial shadow of the nation's battle. But something changed after World War II, and this is where the modern story truly begins. Because after 1945, the debt did not behave the way it had after previous wars. After the Civil War, after World War I, the pattern had always been the same. Run up the debt to fight, then spend the following peacetime years paying it back down. The debt was treated like an emergency loan to be cleared once the emergency passed. After World War II, at first, the same thing seemed to happen. The debt did not fall much in absolute terms, but the American economy grew so explosively in the post-war decades that the debt shrank dramatically as a share of that economy. A booming economy made the wartime debt look smaller and smaller. By the 1970s, relative to the size of the economy, the mountain of World War II debt had been worn down to a foothill. And then in the 1980s, the ground shifted, and the modern debt was born. This is the setup for our decade, so watch closely. In peacetime, with no world war to fight, the United States began running very large deficits anyway. The combination that produced this was new. On one side, a major cut in tax rates, based on the theory that lower taxes would spur growth. On the other, a dramatic increase in military spending to confront the Soviet Union, alongside social programs that continued to grow. Taxes came down, spending went up, and the gap between them, the deficit, was filled with borrowed money, year after year in a time of peace. For the first time, the debt was climbing fast, not because of a shooting war, but because of a permanent structural gap between what the government collected and what it spent. In 1981, the total national debt crossed $1 trillion for the first time. It had taken the country nearly 2 centuries to accumulate its first trillion. It would take only 5 years to accumulate the second. By the end of the 1980s and the start of the 1990s, the deficits had become the central crisis of American politics. The debt was rising relentlessly. Interest payments were ballooning. And there was a widespread, genuine fear that the situation was spiraling out of control, that the world's greatest economy was on an unsustainable path. And this is where our decade opens, and where the most surprising chapter in the entire history of the debt begins. Because in the 1990s, against all expectations, they turned it around. It began painfully at the start of the decade. The president at the time, facing exploding deficits, agreed to a budget deal that included tax increases, breaking a very famous and very public promise not to raise taxes. It was politically fatal for him. It may have cost him the next election, but it was the first step in a genuine attempt to close the gap. His successor went further, and here the story becomes genuinely bipartisan, even though almost no one remembers it that way. In 1993, a new budget passed by the narrowest possible margins that combined higher taxes on top earners with restraints on spending. Not a single member of the opposition party voted for it. It was intensely controversial. Critics predicted it would cause a recession and economic disaster. The disaster did not come. Instead, something remarkable happened. Then came the other half of the equation. And this is the part that makes the story truly bipartisan. After the 1994 elections, the opposing party took control of Congress, and they brought their own fierce commitment to balancing the budget, above all through restraining the growth of spending. So now you had a president from one party and a Congress from the other, locked in bitter conflict on almost everything, including two dramatic government shutdowns, but both, for their own reasons, pushing toward the same fiscal goal. And underneath the political drama, an economic miracle was unfolding. The 1990s produced one of the longest and strongest economic booms in American history. The technology revolution, the rise of the internet and personal computing, created enormous new wealth and, crucially, enormous new tax revenue. Millions of people went back to work, incomes rose, the stock market soared, and capital gains taxes poured into the treasury. Now watch all three forces combine, because this is the mechanism. The one moment the machine ran in reverse. Higher tax rates on top earners brought in earlier in the decade. Genuine restraint on the growth of spending, forced by divided government. And a roaring economy generating tax revenue far beyond anyone's projection. Rising revenue, disciplined spending, and a boom all at once. The deficits began to shrink. Year after year, the annual gap between spending and revenue got smaller. And then in 1998, it happened. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the United States government took in more money than it spent. It ran a surplus, and not a small one. The surpluses grew 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001. 4 consecutive years of surplus, the longest such streak since the 1920s. The government was no longer just slowing the growth of the debt. It was beginning actually to pay it down. Hundreds of billions of dollars of publicly held debt were retired. Think about how strange this was historically. For a century and a half, the debt had only ever fallen meaningfully in the calm years after a war, as the nation paid down what the fighting had cost. But the surpluses of the late 1990s came in peacetime, in the middle of a boom, with no great war to end. It was the first time the machine had reversed not by recovering from an emergency, but simply through the ordinary workings of government revenue and restraint. That had almost never happened before, and it has not happened since, and the political mood shifted with it. For a generation, the deficit had been treated as a permanent, insoluble crisis, a fact of life as fixed as the weather. Suddenly, leaders of both parties were competing to take credit for surpluses and arguing not about how to close a deficit, but about what to do with the extra money. Should it be used to pay down the debt faster, to cut taxes, to shore up retirement programs for the aging population? These were the debates of a country that believed, for a few short years, that it had solved its oldest financial problem. And here's the truly stunning part, the part that has been almost entirely forgotten. At the end of the 1990s, official government projections from nonpartisan analysts seriously forecast that if the surpluses continued, the United States could pay off its entire publicly held national debt within about a decade, potentially by around 2010. Let that sink in. 25 years ago, the end of the national debt was not a fantasy. It was a line on an official government chart. Serious people in Washington were holding meetings about a strange new problem. What would happen to financial markets, which depend on safe government bonds, if the government stopped needing to borrow at all? They were worried about paying it off too fast. For one brief moment, Hamilton's tool had done its work, and Jefferson's dream was back within reach. America was on course to be free of its debt. So what happened? Why are we now at nearly $40 trillion instead of zero? The reversal was breathtakingly fast, and it reveals the deepest truth of this entire story. Because the very forces that had created the surplus all reversed at almost the same time. right at the turn of the millennium. First, the boom ended. The technology bubble that had driven the market and the tax revenue burst in 2000 and 2001. The flood of capital gains taxes dried up. A mild recession set in. Revenue, which had been the engine of the surplus, fell. Second, the policy choices reversed. Large tax cuts were enacted in 2001 and again in 2003, returning much of the projected surplus to taxpayers on the argument that the government should not hoard the people's money. Whatever their merits, they reduced revenue substantially. Third, and most powerfully, came a return of the oldest debt engine of them all. On September 11th, 2001, the United States was attacked, and it embarked on a global war on terror, followed by long, costly wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Military spending surged, and once again, as it had since the founding, the nation chose to fight its wars on borrowed money. Revenue fell, spending rose, and war returned, all within a couple of years. The surplus vanished almost overnight. By 2002, the government was back in deficit, and it has run a deficit in every single year but none ever since the window had closed. The projections of a debt-free America were quietly filed away and forgotten.